the AI, because it's potentially so economically productive, and the value of those things relative to what they can produce with them is so much higher than their current cost. The cost of those things will spike, but it'll spike kind of maybe temporarily. Nvidia is a fabulous semiconductor company, right? Like it doesn't produce anything. I think you kind of the value is going to barbell where the layer underneath Nvidia, like TSMC and SK Hynix and maybe ASML, kind of retain the value because they're doing something physical and hard to replicate. But Nvidia is essentially software. And like you say, software is like the value of existing software is going to devalue as, software gets easier to create.
Do we have to have some kind of disclaimer? This is not investment advice, only for entertainment and, and educational purposes only. Hello everyone, and welcome to the 8th episode of Audio Tokens, the project where we generate audio tokens for our AGI overlords in the future. And this week I have Mark here. Mark started his career as a PhD in Oxford in computer vision, and then he founded a company called P-Link, which did visual search and was acquired by Google in 2010, where he went on to work for a couple of years with computer vision stuff. He then founded another company, which was like a solution for small retailers to go online, and then acquired by Google once again. I wonder what that they seem to like you. So and then now he's an angel investor in companies like Canva, and he also writes a really good blog. And that's how I found you, which is quite interesting because it feels like I should have found you some other way before the blog, but the blog is excellent. So that's, I think, what I want to focus on today. Welcome, Mark, to the pod.
Nice to talk to you, Lucas, and really nice to talk about something different for a change, because I've done the entrepreneur story so many times. It's really nice to talk about something different.
Yeah. I can imagine you would have gotten one or two requests for telling that story, but this story I think is amazing. Me and Axel, my co-founder, we should print one of the graphs from one of your blogs on the wall or something, because we reference it so often. But yeah, basically I would want to start with just the meta question, maybe, like why do you write? Why is educating silicon, which is your blog, why is that a thing?
I think a lot of people probably give a similar answer, in that, writing, I think, sharpens your thinking. Like you start out writing a piece, and often by the time you get to the end of it, you maybe come to a different conclusion than you expected, more about the topic, kind of, it just forces you to kind of organize your thoughts, and you have this vague mash in your head, and you actually realize when you're forced to write it down that it's got all sorts of holes in it. So I think writing is really useful for that and other reasons.
Right. But then you could have written and then not publish it. So why do you publish it?
So funnily enough, I actually for a very long time did not publish. So I have a kind of private blog where I have probably 10 times as much content as I do on the public one. And I did that for a long time because I was able to be just much more honest, completely honest in a private journal. And it's kind of like, it's blog posty type format, but some of it is, personal, some of it's half baked and all sorts of things. And yeah, I only put a minority on the public blog, and I started to put more on the public one recently because I guess I'm talking about a topic more people care about, sort of AI. And also I think like right now I'm not really in the company anymore, so I have a bit more time, and it's kind of useful to interact with other people. You get kind of other people, like stuff like this happens. You interact with interesting people, it sharpens your thoughts. And yeah, it's been more useful to do it in public. And it also doing it in public, you do write it better, so yeah.
Yeah, also takes more time, I guess, because you get maybe a bit nervous about actually putting your opinions out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and going back memory lane, I found a TED talk of you in 2010, which was fun. And I think writing, like you said, it forces you to think about the future, because you write a lot about the future. And you thought about the future back in 2010 as well. And one thing you said in this talk, not to expose you here, but you said that augmented reality is going to be a huge thing. It's going to be everywhere in 5 years. And I don't see that much. So
yeah.
What happened? What went wrong?
I looked at that too there as well, and I heard myself say that, and I was like, oh, interesting. Um, yeah, it's really so. I think the computer vision progressed pretty much as expected. I think if you look at the kind of computer vision side, which is kind of what I was, mostly interested or working on, if you look at that in sort of HoloLens or Oculus or Vision Pro, like the computer vision is really, really sharp, dialed in, like stable, perfect. I think what didn't sort of materialize was the sort of consumer use cases, basically. And at the
Hmm.
time, I think in that talk, I said, like, I thought the main application would be gaming. I was never particularly bullish on the kind of smartphone alternative type use case. Um, but I kind of thought, oh, you'll get it to a cheap enough thing where there'll be, I kind of imagine something a bit like Pokemon Go, but in some sort of like, Wii, Nintendo Wii
Yeah.
type formats, like a kind of, augmented reality console. And I thought that could be a breakout hit. And I guess, Oculus was a very modest hit, and like no, maybe the price point versus the utility just never really got there. Um, I was always not so bullish on the consumer use case. I remember my old boss at Google was very involved in Google Glass, and like one of the thought experiments he had at the time was like, imagine the history had gone the other way around, and that we had like augmented reality headsets before we invented smartphones. And he said you could
Oh.
imagine like Steve Jobs pitching at events saying like, you don't have to have it on your face anymore. Now it can be in your pocket, and like the crowd goes kind of wild. So like it's not obvious that it's actually better to have it. That form factor is
Ah.
necessarily better.
Oh, yeah, that's oh, interesting. And in general, has technology like your predictions, if you did a public blog in 15 years ago, would your predictions have gone as you thought, you think?
I mean, we had like this big discontinuous change in the last 15 years, right? I mean, maybe if you, well, I don't know, maybe you could just see the glimmers of it 15 years ago, but maybe not 16 years ago. I think like, the kind of whole deep learning and, generative AI and like all that stuff was like, at the 10, 15 years, well, 15 years ago anyway, like, the techniques that people were using were like support vector machines, boosting, like Gaussian processes. Like they clearly weren't really on the path to what we have now. And so, I think it was pretty hard to predict what happened. I mean, you could say maybe someone like Ray Kurzweil just looked at a compute curve and predicted it all, and maybe that is kind
Yeah.
of a better way to think about it. Like, sometimes, compute availability just drives everything else. But um, I don't think I don't think the last 15 years were particularly easy to predict.
Hmm. And what do you think about the next 15 years? Are they easier or harder?
So in some sense, it should be easier, right? Because we had this big discontinuity in techniques, and now we have a set of techniques where like there are actually somewhat predictable scaling laws you can look at. You can look at like, chinchilla scaling laws and the inference time scaling laws. And, Meteor just came out with this task length scaling paper, I think
Yeah.
yesterday. And, this stuff is all gated by compute, and compute is also fairly forecastable, right? Data center build outs take a long time. They take a lot of capital. You can kind of foresee the path to some extent. So in that sense, it should be more predictable. And like, and yes, yes, right. The specific capabilities are a bit surprising. Um, you know, I don't know that even now I can give you a really satisfying explanation for why why diffusion models are so good. Like, why did we get really good image generation, but like language modeling is a little bit harder? Or, would you have predicted that self-driving cars are lagging a bit relative to LLMs? Like, these things aren't so easy to predict, right? Even when you can kind of look at you can say, okay, I know how the, kind of perplexity is going to change, right? But I don't necessarily know what that
Yeah.
translates into in terms of applications. And also we're maybe on the cusp of like, there could be more discontinuities, right? You could have like an actual sort of recursive process, right, where like AI starts to do the AI research, and that could change the slope of the curve. So I don't know. Predictions are generally hard.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting, like all of the sci-fi movies from they predicted stuff like flying cars, so and that would be super easy, but like probably couldn't imagine, or some of them did, but like communication like we're having right now on different sides of
Right.
the world in real
Yeah.
time, recording stuff super easy, but flying cars super hard. that might not have been obvious a couple of years ago. So yeah, predicting the future, not hard, not easy at all. I think, who was it that said that like predicting the next 5 years or like the short term is super hard to predict, but like the super long predictions are easier. I think there's like
Yeah, I
some
think
truth to that.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, sometimes the longer term is a bit more predictable, right? And I guess, maybe the sort of like, maybe the Kurzweil type predictions sometimes bear that out, right? You can't, like, Moore's law just sort of kept going, and that kind of prediction is sometimes a bit easier to
Yeah.
make.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the more slow one is like he had 5 data points, and he just like
Yeah,
five
right.
data points and just draw a line, and then
Yeah.
the entire all the like electrical engineering students were like, we should make this our destiny, and then everyone made it. I wonder like if he used some different technique for fitting the line, so the line was a bit steeper. Would that have gone to fruition as well? Because everyone just like made it happen because they so believed in it as a law.
Yeah, right.
That would
Like
be
it was it
interesting.
was it was a target as much as a law, right?
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So yeah, speaking of the future, you have a blog post on like 4 scenarios of AI, and you call it near future AI. And I think some of these seem extremely sci-fi and long timelines, but I think I also agree that this is not that far away. So yeah, do you want to explain the 4 different scenarios that you list here?
Yeah, so like the way I try to think about things, right? Because as we just said, like predictions are kind of a mug's game and they generally go wrong. So I try really hard not to kind of anchor myself on any specific prediction. I try like to have like a range of different scenarios and maybe to some extent have probabilities across those scenarios, but pretty vague probabilities. And
Yeah,
so yeah, in the blog post I lay out like different scenarios. So the first one is like what I call the damp squib, which is that AI is all hype and it's not really going to have any meaningful impact on the world. It might be comparable to NFTs, or it might be comparable to something like 3D printing, which, wasn't wasn't vaporware, but at the same time didn't really change the world in a gigantic way. And I kind of operationalized that and saying like, no company is going to generate more than $1 billion of annual revenue from AI. And I wrote that a year ago, and I think that milestone has already been passed. So maybe this scenario is kind of, probably ruled out at this point. I don't
yeah,
put a huge, even at the time it was seeming unlikely. Um, so the next scenario is like one kind of the typical cycle where you get something maybe comparable to the iPhone in terms of impact, where, it's a big change in the world, but it's the kind of thing that, you happens maybe every 10 or 20 years. Like, we kind of have experienced these things pretty regularly. Um, and then maybe the next scenario up I call Jetson's world, where, AI does basically all of the white collar work, but maybe is just slightly below human level. So it's not sort of advancing the frontier of knowledge on its own. And that I think would be maybe comparable to something like the steam engine, where totally remakes society. It changes the long run rate of economic growth. It changes power relations between nations. It's like a very big historic event. And then there's a level above that, which takeoff, which is like full technological singularity, like an intelligence explosion. So this would be like a Cambrian explosion level event. Something that's like significant on a geological timescale. Like once in a billion years kind of event. Um, and so those are the different scenarios, and then I try and sort of talk about what they might look like and how probable they might be, and also crazily how you might make an investment case against them, because
yes,
that's my day job at the moment, is being an investor.
yeah. And that's actually how I find your blog, because I believe that AGI is coming at some point, maybe very soon, maybe in a couple of years, but at some point. And then most people don't think that. And then if you have a belief that most people don't have, that society will change this much, then
Hmm.
there's probably some way of of making money from that. So I started looking into that. And for me, I really see it as like almost insurance. Like I did engineering in university, so I'm probably going to in most of the scenarios that you lay out, I'm probably going to have a role in society and be pretty well off. But like in the takeoff scenario, I don't know like if I have a role there, and maybe like investing for that scenario is almost like insurance. Like that's
Yeah.
the only way I'm not well off. So let's put all my eggs in that basket, so that even in that scenario, I'm well off. That's how I see it.
Makes
And that's
sense.
why I searched the term like investing for singularity, and then I found your blog. Uh, so yeah, but you have before, because I clicked that investing for singularity, and then you linked back to a previous blog post where you said like investing for the AI transition, which was basically the three first scenarios. How should we think about investing for them? So let's start there. Maybe we can skip scenario one because we almost already surpassed it. But for the scenario two, the typical cycle, um, just
So
TLDR
scenario
of
two is kind of like fairly straightforward. Like it's basically a business as usual scenario where like, AI maybe improves a little bit beyond the current level and then kind of hits a wall and slows down.
yeah,
So, I still think that's a possible outcome. You get something like kind of almost like stockfish for maths and coding. Like you get like superhuman coding and mathematics and maybe a few other areas where AI is superhuman, but it's like, a long way below human at tasks like maybe just, managing a company or something a bit more generic that the models don't really do yet. They don't reach a super high level of generality. And, I think the kind of things that people you would do is like, venture capital might do pretty well, like owning tech stocks might do pretty well. The Magnificent Seven would probably continue to compound their revenue at a decent rate. It's nothing particularly earth shattering in that scenario. And the only thing
yeah,
is that like it might change the kind of things you do as a founder, right? So we were having this discussion a little bit offline, which we might get to later about, is it going to be like vertical AI tools or horizontal AI tools? And I think in a scenario like this, it might be a bit more vertical, right? You might get like, an AI that's sort of like got a lot of scaffolding around it to do well in like a healthcare application, and another one that's good in, an accounting application or something, which is
yeah.
a bit different to one where like AI progress just keeps going and you have just like, the one AI assistant that can just sort of do all of the tasks.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, so in the third scenario, the Jetson world, first maybe to ground that discussion, if I'm someone, if I'm a normal person that has some normal job now, and I'm put into this new world, how do I view the world? Like what is the like yeah practical? Like how does the world look for me?
Yeah, so I think that the sort of operational definition of this scenario is like you get an AI that can do basically anything a remote human worker can do. It's kind of a typical like AGI kind of definition. But I think for the purposes of this scenario, it's just a little bit worse than human at sort of the very most complex tasks, right? It's not sort of winning Nobel Prizes. It's not sort of advancing the frontier of knowledge on its own. It's sort of maybe a huge accelerant, but it's I think because if you get to that point, you're in a very different scenario. So sort of just for the purposes of defining something that's like a little bit further back on the spectrum, it's basically like a white collar worker replacement.
Yeah,
And how does that feel? I think it actually changes much more slowly in this scenario than you might expect. This is one of the things when I started writing it, I kind of expected to write something a bit more radical about the scenario. And as I sort of thought it through, I was like, well, actually, the nuts and bolts of this, the world actually probably changes much more slowly than you think. So, like in a white collar organization, even if the work of a junior level employee can be done by I think, that kind of happens like the junior ranks shrink a bit over time. Maybe you get layoffs in some places, maybe you just get reduced to like hiring through or natural attrition. The senior employees, a lot of the work of a senior employee in existing white collar organization is like, it's political battles, it's reviews, it's strategic decisions. It's the kind of thing that like maybe you can't delegate as easily to an AI. So maybe that doesn't change that much. And if you look at like a regulated profession, you know, even if the AI can diagnose you, maybe the doctor still needs to write your prescription, or the accountant still needs to sign your audit, or the lawyer still needs to represent you in court. And so you might have a situation where like AI is doing most of the work, but the actual structure of the economy doesn't change that much or that quickly. And then you have a few like lightly regulated areas where things go very quickly, right? Like you might have a movie that's like a blockbuster movie that's made by one person. I don't see why that couldn't necessarily happen with really good tooling. Or you could have, a single individual starting $1 billion company, if it's a tech company, online. Like we almost have something like that happening already. Like WhatsApp was, I don't know, 10 or 15 people or something, right? So, but yeah, there's no reason that can't happen. And then you get this diffusion wave where, these super efficient new mode of production gradually outcompetes the old guard. But it's a social change. It takes a long time, and that's what happened in the past, right? And the most technological changes happen in that way, where you get like sort of a vanguard set of companies that really lean into it, and then gradually the rest of society kind of comes kicking and screaming through many decades of social change. Um, I think that's a white collar work. For the blue collar work, you might get some sharp transitions in things like customer support jobs. That already seems to be kind of like largely on the way out. Be data entry, like business process outsourcing. You know, that might hit harder in some places like, say, like India or the Philippines, where it's maybe like 10% of GDP. But I think in the West, like jobs with face-to-face human interaction are probably unaffected. Like if you're a shop assistant or a waiter or doing childcare, like you're probably completely unaffected by this or relatively unaffected. Physical jobs of all kinds probably change pretty slowly. I'm assuming that robotics is going to lag behind a bit. Maybe only lags behind a decade, and then once the robotics starts to kick in, then maybe you have more pervasive changes to blue collar jobs. But I think this is, despite like getting to something that's almost AGI, the actual pace of social change here could play out kind of slowly.
Okay, so slowly, but it still sounds pretty like the change is pretty big regardless. Like people don't have jobs for the most part in this scenario eventually, right? Or like there's
Eventually, maybe
yeah.
eventually, yeah, but it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It might be a sort of generational change, which I think is much easier to kind of digest than
Hmm,
something that happens more suddenly.
hmm. What do you think about like because since you said that in this scenario AI is not as good as humans, but they are obviously much faster and they can do like the majority of the work they are good enough to do because like most humans doesn't push their intelligence frontier during their day work, right? So in this world, those few humans that are left and are really critical, do you like what will happen to them? Will they be like god status or yeah, how do you see what will happen to them?
Yeah, like if you're kind of a scientific researcher or something, or like an AI researcher, like I don't know. I mean, you probably just have like a lot of kind of magnification of your abilities, but um I don't necessarily think that other jobs will completely go away either, right? Just like a large part of the mechanical part of the job will go away, but maybe the sort of social and political part of the job will remain. So this is a kind of a partial automation scenario. Like you get automation of like relatively routine jobs and the routine parts of most jobs. But I think I can imagine, we have a world where AGI almost replaces people and people still go to work and sort of go through the motions. And it's almost a bit like the inside of a large tech company today. Like, there's this incredible amount of resources being generated by like, the Google advertising machine, which is showered upon Google employees, many of whom are not really critical to producing that bounty and just sort of, you know, shuffle paper and play various status games, right? So
Yeah.
like, people can occupy themselves in all sorts of unproductive ways, which I can imagine a scenario like this will work out like that. And what the sort of frontier worker experience is like, maybe not that different, just a bit more amplified.
Hmm. Okay. So basically everyone has the Google benefit scenario at their work
Yeah, they go and get a little
and
lattes and they kind of, do a bit of work here and there.
yeah, it doesn't sound too bad. Uh, so in this scenario, how should one think about investment to maximize if you really believe in this outcome?
Yeah, yeah. So like, I mean, the TAM is basically like a lot of labor, potentially a lot of, the total compensation of employees is about 12 trillion a year in the US for white collar work and about 55 trillion globally. And then blue collar work is about another 25 trillion.
Yeah.
So, I think it's useful to have that as the sort of order of magnitude. And if you look at sort of revenue of something like, the Magnificent Seven, it's about 2 trillion a year. So
Oh,
I think what you're just going to see is like, some of that labor share is going to be consumed by tech companies. And like if you zoom in really specifically, like Microsoft is about $250 billion a year in revenue. And if you look at business process outsourcing, the overall business process outsourcing market, which is like the most obvious thing you'd replace with AI, right? So like if you're currently outsourcing your accounting to, a team offshore, and you can replace that with like an AI worker, maybe the experience is very similar. So business process outsourcing is about 300 billion a year, which is roughly the same size as Microsoft's revenue. And Microsoft's growing 15% a year, so that just provides them, 5 more years of growth if they just occupy that market. But I'm sure there's adjacent, they've other sources of growth, and so basically it just provides a lot of runway for existing companies to basically consume more and more of the economy. Seems like a sort of baseline scenario. So kind of investing in the big tech companies seems like a relatively safe bet. I mean, I think small business could actually do very well. So I spent a lot of time working with small businesses in my last company, and they're always juggling like lots and lots of different things. And, if they could have a sort of virtual employee who would sort of file their taxes and do their marketing or something, like I think that could actually be a really good experience for them. And, outsourcing has never been accessible to small companies because it's just, it's a big company thing to outsource your team to India or something, right? Like your corner shop isn't doing that, but suddenly they could have some of those efficiencies. So I think, you kind of have pretty good experience for small businesses, a pretty good experience for large businesses. Like overall productivity is just rising. Maybe the overall growth rate is nudging up right now. Right now it's a few percent a year. It could be like, 10, 20+% a year. 20, I don't know. In a scenario like this, I think it'd probably be more like 10% or something. Like I don't expect, I think if you get into the much higher growth rates, you're talking about the scenario above this one. So yeah, I mean, essentially, it's also from an investment perspective, relatively business as usual. And then you can kind of get into the granularity of like, would you rather invest in Microsoft over Google, over Meta, over, Oracle? But I think, I can talk about some of that if you want, but I mean, those are the predictions that are most likely to be wrong. I think at a zoomed out level, it's probably just, you own the index and you probably do fine in this scenario.
But in that case, owning the index would be really good. So like if you have a lot of your net worth in stocks, then that's probably a good idea rather than housing or whatever.
Probably. Yeah, I think this is just a sort of supercharged sort of stock market growth or economic growth kind of scenario.
Yeah. What do you think about startups? Is that something that would be well off?
Yeah. I think some startups will do very well. It's a question of like how concentrated versus distributed the returns are. Like, do you have a small number of very big winners or like a large number of, medium-sized winners, right? So like in this kind of SaaS software wave, you had, many kind of unicorns in different areas, right? You kind of, and in the previous wave, like the internet wave, you kind of had possibly relatively smaller number of larger winners, or at least you had some really, really outstanding winners like, Google and Meta and so on. Whereas the wave after that didn't produce anything quite as big. So I think there's a debate about like what that looks like. And it depends again about like, the relative success of vertical versus horizontal AI. But I'm pretty sure there are going to be like lots of niches for startups in a scenario like this. It's going to be, for plenty of opportunity, especially in maybe, more sectors that the kind of horizontal tools don't fit with because, you have to specifically adapt them or they're regulated or like, there's many other reasons.
Yeah. And what likelihood do you put on this third scenario?
So I would say between the third and the fourth scenario, my probability is above 50%.
And fourth is the singularity takeoff.
Yeah. So between sort of AGI and singularity, it's like above 50% at this point. Specifically on this one, it's quite hard to say. I mean, it depends how you define it. Like we might pass through this one on the way to the next one. So like, how does that count exactly? So yeah.
I would say that counts as the singularity. Like my question is like, where do we end up? What is the where is the diminishing returns? Where is the end?
Like if it's kind of in some ways a little hard to get to preserve yourself in this scenario for a long period of time, right? Because it relies on, it relies on progress basically stopping below human level, and
Yeah.
something has to happen to cause that, right? There either has to be, there could be worldwide compute governance, right? We could collectively decide that we're not going to allow ourselves to build more data centers. Like, I don't think that's very likely, but it's a possibility. Or you could have like strongly diminishing returns in the scaling laws, and like we just like run out of steam. Or, you could it turns out that maybe data is key, and we just aren't RL doesn't work that well. We kind of depend on pre-training. We run out of pre-training data. Like, there are scenarios you could concoct where performance stalls, or fundamentally the algorithm is wrong, and like it's just we need some new algorithmic insight. And before that, like maybe they are just stochastic parrots, right? We'll find out that like they're not they don't really generate novelty in the way that we expect. Like, so, but at the same time, I kind of feel like at some point someone's going to have the insight or the extra compute or something to break through that wall. So on a sort of multi-decades timescale, I kind of feel like you have to get to the next scenario. So maybe if you define the timeline over 10 years, I think it's fairly likely we might be stuck in that scenario. If you define it over 30 years, it seems 50 years, it seems much less likely. And if you're talking about an event as big as like, the Cambrian explosion or something, I mean, in what's
Yeah.
a few decades between friends in a way. So it's,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Both scenarios like were alive. That's unthinkable, and the changes are going to be really big. And we do have like an existence proof, like the human brain is an existence proof that you can do this. So
Sure.
I would also expect that it might take a longer time than we think, but eventually
Yeah.
we would
I
go
mean, the
there.
timeline obviously matters because,
Yeah.
we all don't live forever, and so, but it doesn't feel like it's centuries away, right? I think almost everyone agrees on that. So, well,
Yeah.
almost everyone who's close to the problem.
Yes. Even John LeCun nowadays. So let's go there then. The fourth scenario, the singularity. How does it differ from the third scenario?
So this is the kind of like limit point, right? Where you've got AI that's just superhuman across all domains, or at least all domains that matter, basically. And in particular, it's capable of advancing the frontier of knowledge, doing scientific research, doing AI research, potentially improving itself. And you get potentially very, very rapid improvement. People talk about this sort of intelligence explosion type scenarios. You can have, you could have like sort of centuries of sort of technological progress taking place in decades. You can kind of get these very radical outcomes. I guess it's imaginable that you get the super intelligence and you don't get the technological progress because there's some other limiting factor that we're not thinking about. So I think, you don't want to be too certain about exactly what the scenario looks like, but it's certainly very, very, very big deal.
Yes. Yeah, I always thought like I don't know if this is a good AGI definition, but at least it's a good, like the point of recursive self-improvement, right? That I don't know if that's the AGI definition, but it's actually the most meaningful event, basically. When AI is better at creating AI than humans, then we're probably on an exponential. It's not completely true, but because maybe there's like a step change somewhere where like like at some point it's much harder to create the next AI, so that even the AIs, but then I don't know, then humans wouldn't either be able to create it. So yeah,
like
but
there might
anyway,
be diminishing returns to intelligence, right? On some problems there kind of clearly are, right? I mean, if you want to predict the weather forecast, at some like it's a chaotic system. Like, the AI is not going to be able to give you a weather forecast for this day next year with any greater accuracy than like we can already, right? If you want to solve the crisis in the Middle East or something, it might not be better at that. Like, so it might be better in some domains and not others. There might be limits to what you can do, productively with all that compute power, right? So, but it kind of feels like there's a lot of things that you can do that are going to be really impactful.
yeah. But in this scenario, does it even make sense to talk about investing? It feels like it's such a sci-fi future. If I place a bet in I don't know, I buy some Microsoft stock or whatever, will that even matter?
Well, I think you have to sort of set your ground rules a bit, right? So, like, I mean, if you've got an unaligned AI that sort of wipes out the human race and we're all extinct, obviously investment performance is irrelevant. if you have some kind of like omnibenevolent AI that just sort of, ends capitalism and gives everyone an equal share in the proceeds, that's also kind of investment scenarios are relevant. So I think you have to kind of condition on it, like conditional on a scenario where we all survive, maybe market mechanisms and sort of property rights are kind of continuous. Then maybe you can talk about like, how are things going to play out through that transition. But, you know, I'm not even sure what part of the probability space that occupies. It might be relatively small, but it's the one thing you can influence in a way. So you may as well sort of condition on that and then think through.
Okay, so yeah, if we condition then on this scenario where we still have capitalism, we have an aligned AI, so it hasn't killed us all, what can you do?
Yeah, so I think I kind of divided into maybe two periods. There's kind of like a transition phase and sort of a post-transition phase. So in the transition phase, like you wake up in the morning, and Claude 6 has been released, and it's kind of suddenly winning Nobel Prizes, right? And what like the very initial point of that scenario might not be that different to the previous one, where there's all these sort of social frictions. It's taking some time to diffuse. Um, but pretty soon this new entity, it's obviously going to be many copies of it, and it's doing lots of research, and it's going to be generating a lot of economic value, but it's not able to generate, it's not able to do everything on its own. Like for one thing, it's disembodied. So for the start, it will need like, you know, robots aren't that good yet. Like, it's going to take some time to improve robotics or to scale up robotic manufacturing or whatever. So you might imagine that's going to need human assistance with, to carry out its work. And so you might imagine that, you know, compensation rates for human physical labor might go up a lot and human intellectual labor might go down a lot. So like I have a friend who's a data center electrician, and he's probably going to get paid a lot more than right now. Currently, it's the programmers who get paid a lot, right? Maybe it's the data center electricians who suddenly are making $1 million a year or something, right? So
Yeah.
you can imagine things like that. You might also figure out that like what are the cofactors of production for AI? Like what is it that it needs to get its job done? And the most obvious ones are kind of okay. It's probably going to want more power and more chips and more data centers and kind of scale up intelligence. That's sort of the most obvious thing. But there might be other things, right? Like and those are really hard to predict. Maybe it's really interested in DNA sequences, and so suddenly there's like a big rush on DNA sequencing machines, or maybe launch capacity to orbit is suddenly like in great supply, or like bench chemistry equipment, or who knows basically. So anyone who's any company that owns those things, or any person who owns those things, obviously might suddenly be, and like the AI, because it's potentially so economically productive, and the value of those things relative to what it can produce with them is so much higher than their current cost. The cost of those things will spike, but it'll spike kind of maybe temporarily, because after a while this AI, there's going to be a new sort of economy coming into being, that sort of AI created economy. And obviously if we have a DNA sequencing machine and it wants it, right? Okay, that's great now, but maybe a little bit down the line, it's going to have created its own much better DNA sequencing machine, and suddenly that old one devalues very sharply. And so you've got this basically transition period resources where they spike in value and then they crash in value. And then you've got a sort of post-transition phase where all of those transition period goods maybe are no longer in demand, but there's some other set of goods that might be in, have retain permanent value, I guess. And that's maybe the second part.
Hmm. So I guess it matters from which direction we go into the singularity. Obviously it matters, but even from an economical investment perspective. So if the AI wants to take over the galaxy, for example, then stuff that requires you to do that would be in demand. And then but if we tell it that it should just like stay on the earth and be very friendly to the environment and all of this, then it maybe doesn't want to mine up all the minerals in the world. So yeah, it will be very interesting, like who decides that from like, and is it even possible to decide that? Like, would like Sam Altman be able, is this something, because like, yeah, AI systems, like you have a reward function or something, and this is the thing you optimize, and you talk about this, but at a certain point, like we're trying to give it agency, right? Surely it's supposed to be able to figure stuff out on its own then. But then what are the inherent goals? Yeah, it's extremely hard
Yeah, I mean,
question, but
this is like the sort of classic AI safety question, right? About,
yeah,
sort of, you know, how do you specify the goals? Like, are the goals, the consequences of those goals what you expected? Is there some kind of
yeah,
like reward hacking or something, equivalent to that, or just unexpected consequences of something that like we might actually reflect on and say that is actually what we wanted, but it wasn't what we expected. So, yeah, everything is relative to the system's goals, basically. Yes.
yeah. So in terms of investment, then it's hard to make predictions based on that. So probably not investment strategy, but the things that we do know that it really needs is the data center, the energy needs, and all of this, because
It seems like
probably
a pretty strong bet. Yeah.
yeah. So investing in stuff like the grid, people like semiconductors, Nvidia, stuff like this is that
Yeah, I mean, like
something?
all of these things, right, have exceptions, right? If you ask sort of Eliezer Yudkowsky or something, you'd say, oh, well, it'll just like, one-shot nanotechnology and it'll, bypass all of that stuff, right? But I think
Yeah.
in that's pretty,
Yeah,
like
but for the
that's, you can,
transition.
yeah, I think most likely, yes. I think, yeah, the kind of chip fabs and energy infrastructure and all that stuff seems like a pretty strong bet. Yes.
Hmm. You said that the eventually after the post-transition period that you would have like a separate economy, the AI would have its separate economy. Why would that happen? Why wouldn't it just like take over our existing one? Or maybe that's the same thing. I don't know.
I think it's basically about transaction costs. Like, if you think about the frictions of an AI interacting with another AI, the response times are much faster, probably the reliability is much harder or much higher. The cost per token of intelligent output is probably kind of going to be lower than the same thing from a human. So, I guess the economics would essentially probably prefer an AI to interact with another AI than a human unless it has to. Now, like economists love to trot out sort of, Ricardo and comparative advantage and say, oh, well, like, there will always be gains from trade and therefore AIs will always trade with humans. And I think that's sort of mathematically true, but, at some point, we don't trade with chimpanzees, even though, they can grind nuts and collect berries or something. Like, there's at some point, it's just it's not worth the transaction costs, or the reservation wage is below subsidi or like is higher than it's worth paying. So I kind of think that and all AI economy, to the extent that it can happen, is just more efficient.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of embedded assumptions there. Like, there might be humans in the loop by design, um, in order for, ensuring sort of alignment or something. And in that case, maybe the speed advantage of interacting with another human somewhere else is or the speed penalty is less because you've got a human in the loop anyway. So, maybe it doesn't play out that way, or, you obviously, have certain areas where, humans are required for, initially maybe for physical things or for, regulatory reasons, or like, these things are hard to fully predict, but it does sort of seem like, you are going to remake the economy based on the new technology. I mean, that would tend to happen anyway. And so it probably would be much more sort of AI dominant, and it's essentially kind of a parallel economy.
Mm. And in this world where you have this parallel economy, what is the transaction medium for this AI? Do you like, yeah, we don't know for sure, but how could you envision what's the optimal way for them to trade? Or maybe to start, like what are the how does it look different, and what we need to accomplish that system?
Like I don't know. You can't predict it. I mean, they might trade in dollars, they might trade in
Yeah,
Bitcoin, they might trade in, yeah, like I guess crypto is something that some people think might be used. I mean, but like the value of like something like a Bitcoin is essentially like it's because it's got a lot of humans coordinated around it, right? The value Bitcoin's valuable because we've collectively decided to use it. It's like a Schelling point. If you if the AIs were to like launch, AI coin tomorrow and all decide to use it, there's, that's just as likely, they can maybe coordinate in a different way. There's no reason that maybe like existing crypto will necessarily hold value or existing anything. Um, or maybe you can have some sort of wild possibility where you have a sort of post monetary way of like, of coordinating. Like right now we coordinate through the price system because it's like a distributed optimizer, and it's like maybe they can solve the central planning problem, right? Like the economic calculation problem. It's you could have a radically different way of organizing production. I think one of the interesting things here, which is it's a bit sci-fi, but Dorkesh sort of brought it up recently, is about something that pervades sort of all of our assumptions about how the economy works is our principal agent problems, in that an economy is composed of like individual agents who have individual preferences, and like my goals are not the same as your goals, and the goals of the stockholders of a company are not the same as the goals of the employees of the company. If you have AIs that are copies of the same AI, even agent is like, you've got a sub agent and a sort of whatever super agent, and they all share the same goal system. Maybe they can they can coordinate in very different ways to what we're used to. They act more like a single entity, and maybe the internal trading within an entity like that could be very different, or just not price based. It's hard to it's hard to predict this stuff. It could be very different to what we're used to.
Yeah. Is there any point of trying to build this now, or do you think the AIs will develop it themselves in the future? Is this a $1 billion startup idea, basically? Would you invest if someone had some solution to this?
I mean, trying to make any investments now that are going to be like sort of like robust through kind of this once in a sort of billion years event seems really hard. I mean, I like Stripe is a great company, right? But I don't know, like I'd be happy to own Stripe stock, like, but it's a reasonable bet. Payments seem fairly sticky, but I don't know. Will it be there on the other side? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's probably the AIs at that point will just not go with the like suboptimal solution that some human built and just do it themselves. So it seems like one of the harder bets to make in this. It is more safe to just, I don't know, invest in the grid or something.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Yeah.
So this have been like talking about investing in some like secondary effects of AI, but is there a possibility of actually getting a stake in the ownership of AGI itself?
This is right. So this is another way to diversify yourself, is right. Well, maybe the owners of AI, sort of all the value accrues to them, right? So the only thing that matters is owning stock in OpenAI or something, right? And that's possible. I mean, I kind of think if OpenAI or something, or some model truly kind of becomes worth the entire value of the world economy, then probably it would be nationalized or something. Like it doesn't seem like
right.
That much concentration is sort of a stable outcome. But say it's sort of more moderate. Maybe there's multiple winners. It doesn't seem like it's a bad place to be to own part of the AGI sort of makers in this scenario. And you can have scenarios, right, where a small lead snowballs, right? So somebody's a few months ahead, they kind of get to the AGI model first, or the superintelligence model first, and then they acquire the kind of critical resources maybe a few months ahead of the next player, and that's enough to sort of cement their lead. And so you could have a sort of single winner. So how do you do that from an investment perspective? Well, quite a few of the players like are public companies, right? So Google, Google DeepMind, you can just buy stock in Google, or Meta, you can buy stock in Meta. For someone like OpenAI, well, they're like 50% probably owned by Microsoft. I don't know what the exact number is, but something like that. Anthropic, I mean, it came out recently that Google has a 14% stake, and Amazon probably has 25-30. So roughly half of Anthropic you can also get exposure to from Google and Amazon. Then you get to some of the more sort of obscure ones. So like, well, not obscure, but like, less connected to the public market. So like XAI. So like if X is the first to get there, that's a fully private company, or SSI, that's Ilya's company. Yeah, how do you get exposure to something like that? Well, there's venture capital funds who back them, but they're generally not accessible to mere mortals. There are some ways to do it. So there's a company called Sofina, for example. It's a European company that it's a public stock. About 50% of its market cap is positions in VC funds. So I don't know what specific funds they own, but there's some listed entities that own these VC funds. So maybe you can get, some of the value will flow back to the public markets like that. And then there's DeepSeek, I think, has no connection to the public markets as far as I'm aware. So, if DeepSeek kind of finds the answer first, then, sorry, no use. All your investments didn't pay off.
Yeah. But do you think the Microsoft, is it a good investment in Microsoft even if OpenAI wins? I mean, obviously, but is the connection strong enough? Or compared to making a bet in some secondary effect like Nvidia or something like that?
I mean, it sort of depends on the relative value of the outcome, right? So Microsoft's market cap is what, $2 trillion or something, right? So, if OpenAI becomes worth $1 trillion and they own 50% of it, well, it's a nice increase on Microsoft stock,
Yeah.
but it's not that important. If OpenAI becomes worth $1,000 trillion, then it
Right.
will significantly increase Microsoft stock. And 50, I think the more important part is that 50% of that value goes into the public markets, which are relatively broadly owned. The other 50% of the value is going to be highly concentrated in some early engineers at OpenAI and whoever the investors are. The investors are, I guess, the VC funds, they have LPs, and so the money flows back to the LPs, which could be the Stanford Endowment or the Ontario Teachers Pensions Fund or whatever, right? So you could have some very well capitalized teachers pension funds or something with trillions of dollars in them, but that money is somehow flowing back to a wider set of participants, and then you have a small number of people who maybe make insanely large amounts, who maybe are kind of the early execs at these companies. But that's kind of maybe a magnified version of what the world looks like right now. It doesn't seem totally crazy, especially because most 50% of the value is in the public markets. I think it's a bit different if someone like DeepSeek wins and you have this fully private actor who suddenly has something equivalent to a large percentage of world GDP or something. So yeah, but I think in all of those scenarios, probably you're going to have some sort of state action. I don't think that they're really kind of stable politically.
Right. And if they become state owned, is there some way of getting some secondary secondary effect from it?
I mean, maybe pick where you're a citizen to the extent that you can.
Yeah. Yeah. True.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I think that's probably the best advice you can give in that scenario. I mean, there are some other things, right, which are a bit more generic that you can do. I mean, maybe things that are in fixed supply, right? Land is in fixed supply. And, the reason land prices have gone up a lot in, say, Silicon Valley is because, all the tech companies went up in value and suddenly all the surrounding land goes up in value too, right? And so you would expect the same thing probably to happen with something like this, where the world economy grows massively. And if you just own some land, that's one thing that can't just be, produced. It's inelastic. So you would expect it to rise in value. Now, I mean, maybe you can kind of get some crazy counter argument that, okay, we're going to construct a Dyson sphere around the sun, and suddenly there'll be so much land that existing land doesn't. But I think you probably would find it valuable in the short term, and maybe valuable, land on Earth is still finite. Maybe that has useful value.
Yeah, or maybe it's not land is not that useful. Maybe the AGIs create stuff maybe inference costs isn't that high, so you don't need that many data centers or something like that, and then it we're not occupying that big of a percentage of the world's surface at the moment. Yeah. And if you expand to floating cities on the water and then maybe dig down in the ground, there could be an argument that even with the AI takeover and all of this, the land prices will stay pretty the same because it's not that valuable.
I think you can run that argument, and it does, it is coherent. On on the other hand, like, I mean, land prices generally historically have risen with the economy.
Mm.
So like it is fixed supply. You kind of, my default assumption is it probably would rise. I mean, the other thing that's sort of fixed supply is sort of like art or historical artifacts.
Mm.
The price of art has generally increased with the stock market, and you could imagine that,
Mm. Really? Okay.
um, if you own an old master painting, like, there aren't any more of them. That's a sort of, it is to some extent like a fashion. You could just,
Yes.
people could collectively decide they don't like them anymore, but they are in fixed supply, and therefore, the price should be uh, should scale basically with this enormous GDP growth. The other thing is the value of time might change. So if everything runs very fast, like, I mean, imagine like right now, if you're like really rich and you're constructing a big house, you can buy a mature tree, right? That somebody grew that tree for 20 years and they bring it to you on the back of a truck, and like they sit it in your garden. If everyone suddenly gets really rich at the same time and they all want mature trees, like, you can't you can't scale the supply because it takes 20 years for those trees to grow. So
Yeah.
so things that require large amounts of time to produce, maybe also at least temporarily. Yeah, I don't know. I think the lazy option is land.
Yeah. And that, like, going back to the going into this perspective of this is a insurance policy, basically. I'm investing
Mhm.
to have, then land makes a lot of sense because at least you will have somewhere to live. Like if you have this
All right.
scenario of AGI takeover and they occupy all the land everywhere with data centers, cut down all the forest, floating cities on all the waters. But at least you bought your land, so you have somewhere to live, while all your friends, they have to like live in bunkers underneath the ground or something.
Well, hopefully we don't end up there, but yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, maybe not the happiest picture, but at least you can see sunlight. So we talked a lot about NVIDIA because it seems like the obvious choice because compute is obviously going to be needed. They are the biggest provider. However, I have started to think that maybe they are a bit like even in this scenario, they are not the best bet because their moat basically is this like CUDA software moat. I think Semi-Analysis did an excellent post on like they compared CUDA versus AMD and basically NVIDIA versus AMD and NVIDIA, the hardware is pretty similar, but like and AMD's
Yeah.
software is just terrible. But in this scenario, surely you have AI software engineers that writes perfect kernels for all the AMD stuff, and the software moat kind of disappears.
Yeah,
Is
I
NVIDIA
agree.
still the best option here?
No, definitely not in this scenario, and possibly not even in the scenario below it, right? Where, I think the NVIDIA is kind of like NVIDIA is a fabulous semiconductor company, right? Like it's like it doesn't produce anything. I think you kind of the value is going to barbell where, the layer underneath NVIDIA, like, TSMC and SK Hynix and maybe ASML kind of retain the value because they're doing something physical and hard to replicate. But NVIDIA is essentially software. And like you say, software is like the value of existing software is going to devalue as, software gets easier to create. Now, maybe they have some sort of supply chain mastery or something, or maybe they've got tied in contracts, but those I think can't last forever. Um, so yeah, I think Nvidia is kind of like, basically we're in a squeeze right now. And like, it's like, the squeeze is like massively benefiting Nvidia, but in the medium term, I don't think it's such a good investment. Now I did have a bit of a debate with Tammy Besaroglu from Epoch AI about this a while ago on X, and he was saying that like he sort of made the opposing case that like, okay, the cost of current quality software is going to go towards zero, but software complexity could expand so much that the prices remain the same or go up. So if you think of NVIDIA software, maybe they're able to optimize their chips so much, using AI that they maintain an edge, right? Because they have, essentially that they're using their own compute to stay ahead. I don't know though. I kind of think that you get diminishing returns, like, that the amount that you can extract from a better architecture has just got some ceiling. And yeah, I think it's sort of the the physical layer underneath that where the value is in NVIDIA won't retain the value.
Mm. Yeah, and it's certainly a possibility. I think even George Hotz he's been bashing AMD for quite a while, but he had a post recently where he said something along the lines that we're saying right now. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's
And
interesting.
all NVIDIA's customers want them to have competition, right? Like even if you don't have to imagine sort of super intelligence for AI to live,
Yeah,
for NVIDIA to lose its monopoly, like it's just going to happen.
yeah. Although
But
they
but
do
over
have
over
they,
go
they
ahead.
do have like it's like a cat with 9 lives because their margins now are so insane
Hmm.
compared to AMD's. I don't quote me exactly on the numbers, but like the margins for Nvidia is like above 50 or something, and then AMD's margins are like 5% or something, and it's
Yeah.
so they can just like cut prices many times, and they will still be the best alternative for that price.
Yeah. I
So
think in over the next sort of 5 years, like they seem pretty secure. Yeah.
mm, mm,
But and that period of time could be, a lot of money could be spent. So, I think like I own some Nvidia stock right now, and I'm not selling it just yet.
yeah, 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 same, but also some AMD.
Yeah, me too.
To so yeah, okay. Do we have to? I have not talked about investments on previous podcasts. Do we have to have some kind of like disclaimer? This is in not investment advice, only for entertainment and and educational purposes only. So yeah,
Yep.
maybe I should have put that before the entire discussion. Everyone already went away and sold all their Nvidia stocks. No, hopefully not. So investing in AI verticals is an interesting topic, I think, because I wrote a blog post about this a while back. And the first thing we talked about when we chatted offline was basically that we found that we both kind of agree with this, maybe not exactly the same. But my hypothesis is basically, yeah, the horizontal players will be able to do everything that the AI verticals are going to do, and then there's not really a place for the AI verticals. And when we say verticals here, they are like custom solutions using AI for a specific domain. So maybe like a ChatGPT for lawyers or something like that. Yeah, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I really liked your blog post, so that was awesome. And I think it I think it depends a bit on the timeline. If timelines run fast, like if AI improves quickly, then the rising tide will just, you know, the generalist tools like the chat GPTs or whatever will just get good enough to do, any drop-in remote worker type work. And a lot of these vertical sort of point solutions that are based on, some engineering scaffolding are just going to get steamrolled, right? That seems pretty clear. There are probably some exceptions, like you said as well, like where, maybe you've got some cornered resource, like you have some special data that, you know, only you can access. And, if you start now rather than even 2 years from now, you're going to build up this commanding lead based on, you know, proprietary data or, something else. Access like being deeply embedded with the customers, and they're just really sticky and hard to change, or like, it's a regulated industry and you have a license and the other player takes so long to get the
Mm,
license that like you kind of are able to sort of import the horizontal capabilities, and the customer relationships are what matter. So like there are some cases like, or maybe the timeline runs really long. So like instead of 2 years to a horizontal agent that's good enough, it's 10 years. And like 10 years is plenty of time to build like a really successful company and maybe IPO or something, right? So um yeah, it does depend, but overall, I would be pretty reluctant to bet on like a vertical solution that I think Sam Altman was saying this as well. Like unless you're excited about the models getting better, there's probably something wrong with your business model. If your business model relies on the models kind of staying roughly where they are, or needing your scaffolding, then that's a uncomfortable place to be.
yeah, I think though there's a lot of people that fool themselves into believing no, my thing actually would benefit from from more AI capabilities, but really it that's a big question mark. But so I agree with many of your points, but I think it's kind of it's vague because you don't know. Yes, there's some areas that are going to be regulated, and yes, there's some you would have some like proprietary data. But how common will that be? Because I agree there will
Hmm.
be things like this, but I just think they will be super few. So even like legal tech AI, people are like, oh, but that's a very slow moving and regulated space and all of this. So they will not have this transformation. But I think it's actually like way more rare. Like it's actually the super edge cases that are still going to survive. What do you think here?
Yeah, like if the timelines are quite quick, like if we quite, say with three years from now we have like really capable kind of horizontal agents, then you're probably right.
Hmm. Do you think so? There's a lot of like you seem to not, but there's a lot of investment in AI verticals. I think YC put out a like request for a startup to do more AI verticals, and it seems like a lot of. I went to alumni demo day 1 week ago or something, and it seemed like most of the startups there are AI verticals. Do you think they and other VCs that make this bet are making a mistake, or is there like something that I'm missing here?
I mean, VCs regularly herd like lemmings into whatever the hot thing is, right? And I don't think that's a particularly strong signal about what's going to happen. We've had so many waves of excitement over, whatever the flavor of the month is. I think partly it's a reaction to like maybe a few years ago, everyone was investing in sort of like AI foundation models. And I think collectively the VC community has now realized that there's like a small number of very, very large winners in like that space you can't compete in. And so they're kind of just sort of turning the handle to the next obvious thing, which is like one layer up the stack AI verticals. Um, and I think also like there's, I see a lot of the VC sort of LP pitches on the other side, and like LPs are desperate to invest in AI, and so they kind of they want AI companies in the fund, and those are kind of the most obvious one. They're kind of like, oh well, it'll just be like SaaS. I think most people don't extrapolate the world like the trends very far ahead. They just sort of look at the world as it is right now and just assume basically the world will be relatively static.
Hmm.
And if the world was relatively static, I think vertical AI is not such a bad bet. I think people just aren't, thinking the way you are about how fast the capabilities will increase. I think that's
Hmm.
part of it. I mean, I don't want to put words in other people's mouths, but yeah, that's sort of maybe
Sounds
what it
right.
looks
Yeah.
like from the outside.
Yeah. Hmm. Okay. Yeah, and then one of your other switching topics here to one of your other blog posts that have this amazing graph in it that me and my co-founder are referencing all the time. And this blog post is like, where is the world rich in feedback? Because I think this is going to be a very important thing in the near future. We have seen like these reasoning models like O1 and R1, they are all trained on math and coding because math and coding and games have easy feedback loops where you know like the domains are verifiable. And
Hmm.
but you also see like if you take these models and you evaluate them on like something like creative writing that is not verifiable, then they are not better than the previous generation of models. So yeah, what is the so where do we have feedback in the world is very important because it seems
Hmm.
like wherever we have feedback we get superhuman performance. So yeah,
Right.
what's the blog post about? Maybe what's the TLDR
Yeah, well,
and
there you pretty
what's
much
the
summed it
fun?
up, right? It's
Okay.
like, I guess maybe start with like, right, pre-training has driven things up until now, right? So you just train on more and more sort of, generalist internet data, and these, the base models are getting better based on like, more data and more compute. And at some point, that data is going to run out. Like, this is the Elias Escobar's talk at Europe's was saying this, and I think he's getting misquoted. People are saying it has run out. I don't think he said it has run out. He said it will run out. How soon exactly? Like, uh, I mean, it's kind of reaching kind of saturation points ish now, but I think there probably are ways that you could keep pushing that paradigm if you wanted to. Um, I don't think people have really tried all the tricks just yet, but it's certainly kind of at some point, and that point is like not maybe too many years in the future, you're going to run out of like, there's a finite amount of like internet data to train on, and it will run out at some point. And so after that point, you need something else to train the models with. And the thing that is starting to work and is getting everyone excited is reinforcement learning, which was the old thing and it's now the new thing again, right? It's the return of reinforcement learning, and it's come out in sort of inference time scaling with these models like O1. But it's also, if you want to generate synthetic data to train your base model, it's basically the same thing. Like you want to you want to generate sort of some data with an LLM, and you're going to try and verify if that data is correct in some way. And if the data is correct, then okay, that's good synthetic data you can put back into your base model, or it's also something you can use to reward your reinforcement learning agent. So basically, what you want is a feedback signal from the world about when the model is right and when it's wrong about some particular task, and that drives everything basically from now on, I guess. Or maybe there's other tricks to be found, but that's certainly one new kind of scaling law that we're just at the bottom of. And some sources of reward are much easier to find than others, right? Or they're much easier to specify than others. Like as you say, like verifiable domains, right? Like mathematics, if you prove a theorem and you put it through like if you write it in Lean, which is a sort of formal proof language, the Lean compiler can tell you if your proof is valid or not. So, if there's a statement of a mathematical conjecture, the model can try lots of potential proofs, and when it hits on the right proof, the Lean verifier just goes, yes, this is correct, and so then the model can get better and better at doing that. And similarly for coding, if your tests pass, then that like if your code compiles, that it's valid. If your tests pass, that that your tests are passing, which maybe indicates something. Or if you have a benchmark that you're trying to optimize, or maybe the benchmark score goes down. So there are various sort of objective signals you can use to see if your code is getting better. Now, some of these things are subject to like reward hacking, which is a problem, where the model finds a way to increase the score that isn't actually doing what you want. But basically, those are verifiable domains, and anywhere there's a gap between sort of generation and verification difficulty, you've got a potential to increase your performance. So like creative writing is one where I don't think it really has happened yet. I mean, OpenAI just released a model that is sort of tuned for creative writing. I don't know what they did there, but in general, like it is easier to recognize a good book than it is to write one. And so that also, is a method whereby you can potentially improve performance through this same kind of cycle of, reinforcement learning, perhaps. There's a potential there for sort of drift of preferences away from, if you're going to score what's a good book on the basis of an LLM doing the scoring, like there's no, like what maximizes the LLM's preferences might not be what maximizes human preferences. So it's not as easy as maths, but that's the basic setup, right? And then you think about like, all the different places in the world you can source reward. And so that's really what the post is about. It's like, where is the world rich in these feedback signals? And like, I think broadly speaking, there's two categories. There's like search against a computational verifier, which is kind of what we've been talking about so far. So like a computational verifier is like a Lean compiler, or, like a benchmark for or set a test suite, or if you're playing a computer game, the computer game gives you a score. So the model can search against something where you can lock it in a black box, and it can just get better at playing the game because it's getting direct feedback from the game. And then the other way you get feedback is from like actually interacting with the physical world, and that's where things get a little bit more difficult, right? So if you're trying to get better at like doing chemistry, like you at some point probably have to put things in a beaker and see what happens, and search it. Like then the cost of getting one of these observations and like reward signals is basically, well, it costs time, because you have to set up the lab experiment and the chemicals have to react, and it also costs money because the reagents cost money. And so you can plot these two things on like a 2x2 graph, where on one axis you've got time and the other axis you've got cost, and sort of they kind of line up with time and cost, but there's some exceptions. Like high frequency trading, for example, you can get data points very quickly, but they cost a lot more money than they do from playing chess against yourself or something where it's relatively free. And then there's other types of things where like passive data gathering from just like CCTV or something like that is cheap, but it takes a lot of, maybe it takes time to like observe interesting data. And so, yeah, you can think about this sort of set of this space of different things that RL is good at. And maybe that predicts basically near-term AI progress. You'd expect it to get better faster at the things where reward is fast and reward is cheap. Well, I mean, maybe it can get better fast at if someone spends enough money, the ones where it's fast and expensive are also so applicable. And so yeah, the kind of the top right of the graph where it's all fast and cheap is things like maths, coding, games, and that's where we've seen all the progress so far. Maybe the next level down is kind of like digital exhaust of humans on the internet. So stuff like ad click-throughs and sort of content, kind of preferences on TikTok. And like there's a lot of businesses built on that kind of data already. And then you come down a little bit further and you've got stuff like maybe customer service satisfaction. People, you have a customer service interaction and you kind of at the end, somebody asks you, hey, like, was your problem solved? And, those kind of data points are a little bit slower to collect and a little bit more expensive, but in principle, like, maybe that's something that's subject to RL, maybe in the somewhat slightly further out future, or, you're releasing a new model for self-driving cars and you're going to see how often the disengage rate is going to happen, right? Well, that's a bit more expensive and it takes maybe a little bit longer. And then, maybe at the very, very bottom end, you've got something like, crop yield, right? Or crop yield takes a while because the crops have to grow, or like venture capital success, because it takes 10 years to figure out if you're any good as a venture capital investor. So, those data points take a very long time to collect. And so you would expect the systems to improve much more slowly at those tasks. Now, you can maybe break the rules a little bit if you have a really good simulation, where the simulation kind of lets you shortcut, waiting for the real data, but that's gated by how good your simulation is. So
yeah, and then you probably get reward hacking because these models are really good at finding the loopholes in the simulation. Okay, interesting. And you said something along the lines that you can predict AI progress, but by see how far down to the bottom left you need to go. It's interesting because like we said, the models now that are trained on math and coding are only really good at math and coding and nothing else. And but basically, so that tells you that maybe you need to train on crop yield in order to be good at crop yield, and then AGI will be very, very far away because then you have to wait several years. But then again, like I could probably predict crop yield pretty like I'm not a farmer, so I shouldn't say too much here. But like I have general intelligence, and I never went to some farming school or something like that. So obviously you don't need all the data points, and hopefully there will be some transfer. How like far, I know it's hard to say, but like how far down to the left do you think we have to go after this like digital things, what do you call them? Digital artifacts of humans. How do we have to go even further down to the left, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? Because reinforcement learning is just one tool in the toolbox, right? It's not the way we learn everything, and it's not, necessarily the way every AI system is going to learn. So, yeah, I guess the right question is how much transfer are you going to get? And I think actually from the math and coding training, there is some transfer. Like, the models like O1 and O3, like they're better at the ARC challenge, right? The ARC benchmark. And that's not specifically something they're trained on, or I mean, there was maybe a very, very minuscule amount of training. So I think like you see that these like extended thinking models, right? They learn somewhat general principles in terms of like, backtracking and, considering multiple alternatives and so on. Yeah, so I mean, it is a good question, like, and it probably maps to some extent to the human experience, like human skill distribution. Like, how well do you transfer to a new task? Like, how much do you need specific training on the task versus how much does your general knowledge let you be good at farming or something? Like what's the balance between essentially book learning and practice? And I think different skills have different balances of those two things. And maybe some practice in certain domains is essential, but maybe not that much, right? So yeah, it's it's going to be a mixture, I think. And there are probably other learning methods that we still haven't incorporated. I think like one thing that I'm sort of thinking about a bit at the moment is like the sort of incubation effect, where like you think about a problem for a long time and you just have this aha moment, and the solution arrives in your head. And like that I think is quite different to the chain of thought type reasoning. And there's a couple of different things that might be. You kind of see there's people doing test time training, test time morale. Like there's stuff around maybe like latent space reasoning. Like there's probably going to be other tools in the toolbox, is what I'm saying, and maybe some of them help you kind of crack some of these problems in different ways.
Hmm. What do you think about robotics data? Some people claim that we will never have AGI until we have embodied AI, because like the reason why we as humans have intelligence is that we can move our head and then see the feedback based on that, and we have this like constant loop of feedback from interacting with the world. Do you think this is something that is going to be
I think
required
that's
for?
nonsense.
Okay.
Like I did my PhD in robotics. It's been ages. I love robots, but like I just don't get the whole embodiment argument at all. Like I mean, like it's useful data, right? It teaches you things, but I really don't think it's essential. I mean, yeah, like at some point interacting with the world is essential, right? If you want to like learn, like we were just saying, you need to gather a reward signal, and sometimes to do that you need to perform an experiment, and to perform an experiment you have to somehow like influence your environment. I think like a purely observational agent, probably can learn everything, but much more slowly. And so I guess maybe that's what people are actually driving at when they say embodiment. I think I would really say just the ability to take actions in some
Hmm.
form is sufficient.
Yeah, and that can be in a digital environment
Yeah,
and doesn't have to be.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Yeah, on the topic of robotics, how we said a couple of times that robotics might lag behind a bit. What is your expected timelines for that lag?
It's sort of it's hard to say. Like I mean, the robotic hardware is fine. Like like the current hardware is really quite impressive. I mean, the sort of recent demos from like Unitree and Boston Dynamics and so on. Like those robots can do like stuff I can't do. I can't do a cartwheel and they can, right? So they're pretty good. They're super mark physicality already.
Yeah.
So but I think like and you see the very impressive teleoperation demos where like even like years ago, Willow Garage or the Aloha project at Stanford, like you can get the existing robotic hardware to tidy the house and cook the dinner, like maybe not perfectly, but like the bottleneck is not the hardware. I think the bottleneck is the software. It's like the learning, which is kind of interesting because we have really good learning algorithms, right? And I think the basic bottleneck is the data, right? If we had as
Mm.
much like data, like if we had the equivalent amount of data for like as we have for LLMs for robots, I'm pretty sure they would be performing, they would be performing at a sufficiently high level to be commercially useful. Um, so it's basically it's a data problem, and it's not super easy to collect that data, right? Because it depends, right? Like, can you get it from observation? Like, if you can just look at a lot of videos of humans performing a task and transfer that to a robot, then that data is easy to collect. If you have to actually perform the data by teleoping the robot, that data is really hard to collect and really slow. Um, so I guess it sort of comes down to like which of those is the answer basically in terms of like what the algorithms need to learn effectively. And there are maybe some like middle grounds. Actually, I invested in a company recently that's doing something a bit like they're trying to be like scale AI for robotic data. So, I think this is going to be, a really interesting market and problem. But yeah, the timelines, I don't know. I think like it feels at least 5 to 10 years behind LLMs. I mean, there might be some acceleration there if you can suddenly find a clever hack to get more data. The other thing is about the error rates, right? Like I think one of the reasons self-driving is lagging is because the necessary error rate is really, really low. Like it has to be, you know, one fatality per like million miles or something, right? It's human drivers are, in some ways not that good, but they're actually, they crash relatively infrequently. And you know, like error rates in other applications are quite, it's acceptable for like a diffusion model, like if it produces two images and one of them is crap, well, that's fine. You just pick the other one. But like, if your car crashes every second time and not okay. So
Yeah.
and driving the error rates down is something that like it's basically related to the sort of, perplexity of the model, I guess. It improves quite slowly with scale. And so it depends on the application. Like, do the robots need how low an error rate is acceptable for the robot? Like, if it cleans your kitchen, but it smashes one piece of crockery per day, like, is that acceptable? So maybe yeah. So I also think there are some issues with the hardware. Like, right now, that something that's really neglected is touch sensing. Like, we do an awful lot with touch sensing, and the current robots are relatively open loop. Like, they don't have skin, and I think being able to reach human level performance without touch is pretty hard. So um, maybe that's more more of an answer than you wanted. I didn't really give you a number, but like that's sort of what's in my head.
Well, that you said in the beginning you don't like to put you want to distribute the probability mass over different things.
Yeah,
So
right.
that's the answer I expected. Cool. I'm also very curious about, like, you joined Google twice with like a decade in between. I was at Google in 2022 or something like that. So I saw the last part of your Google stay. How did Google change those 10 years apart?
I mean, it just followed the journey that I think every big company follows, right? As companies get bigger, I think it's people understand, right? They get a bit more bureaucratic and like, the kind of people who get annoyed by bureaucracy kind of like self-select out, and then the people who are tolerant of it stay, and then they get a bit more bureaucratic and they get a bit more risk averse, which I think is kind of rational, to be honest. Like, the kind of risks that's reasonable to take when you're a startup versus, kind of a $1 trillion company are just like radically different. And they're subject to different pressures in terms of regulation. So it's like, it's a mix of kind of, you know, rational change and the sort of like decay, cultural decay. And, Google still has pockets of absolute excellence, like absolute excellence, but I think the pockets of big company itis are also increasing.
Mm.
And you look at it externally as a kind of it's still growing its revenue very effectively. It's still like one of the, you know, most productive companies per employee in the world. Like, there's a lot of good things about it, but I think the experience internally of the average person is definitely not as fun as it was in the early days. I think there's like pretty much
Mm.
everyone would agree with that.
Okay. Even though they have more benefits than ever, I guess. But but yeah,
Yeah.
how do you expect them to have a shot in the AGI race between OpenAI and Anthropic? And
I mean, I think they can build it. I'm less sure if they can ship it. You
okay,
know, I
what
mean,
does that mean?
like, I'm pretty sure Google could build AGI, but maybe like they just can't get it through all the launch reviews, or like they're too
Ah,
conservative, or you know, I'd never bet like Demis Hassabis is amazing, DeepMind is amazing. They have incredible people. Like, Shazir is there. Like, they have incredible. Like, there's no doubt that they have all the talent, and in some ways, like they have the best infrastructure, the most capital. Like, TPUs are a fantastic, accelerator. They have the most data. They have a lot of things on their side of the table. Like, and yes, and yes, like they're not currently the most performant model
yeah.
on at least a lot of metrics. They're not the most popular AI model by revenue. I think they're like fourth most used model, like partly because the developer experience is kind of not as good, partly because they were a little late to the market. I mean, you could have asked this question as well about cloud. Google has the third most popular cloud behind AWS and Azure, but they had the best infrastructure. Like, they invented all this stuff first. So technical leadership just doesn't guarantee commercial leadership, and I think
Mm.
you could very easily see the same thing happen here. Uh, I mean, maybe if you just get to like sort of super intelligence first, and like you have by far the best product, or even AGI first, and you have by far the best product, then all that doesn't matter. But um, I don't know. I mean, they wouldn't be my top bet. Yeah, maybe infrastructure is destiny. I don't know. It's like it's they're fighting themselves a bit, and yeah. they so far haven't they so far behave pretty much as you would expect.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
technically excellent, but then the product is sort of a bit hamstrung by the um, constraints of a big company. And
Yeah.
the other thing is they're in like a business model kind of corner, right? You know, they're cornered by their own business model, like in the sense that yeah, all the money comes from monetizing search. If you flipped over search tomorrow to be a ChatGPT type experience, like entirely, they don't know how to monetize that yet, and all their revenue would go. And so like they have to walk this really narrow path where they don't, you know,
Yeah.
don't sort of cannibalize their well, do cannibalize their own business, but that's not too fast. And you know, other competitors are not under those constraints. And you know, like I find myself asking models questions all the time that I would have asked to Google. I do fewer searches, and you know, there are many different players now. They don't have the sort of unique sort of stranglehold on search anymore. So I think it's quite a difficult position.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, to say the least, the innovator's dilemma. So
Exactly.
last question. So assuming that everything goes well, we're in scenario 4, AI utopia. There's no misalignment problem. We live in like abundance, and everything is super nice. And you look back at the, let's say this is in 10 years, and you look back at the previous 10 years, so the 10 between 2025 and 2035. What are the things that you are like the most proud of that you did during these years?
I mean, one thing I'm doing right now is I'm just sort of engaging in what I call kind of pre-nostalgia, where I'm like, you know, this world that we're in might be changing very rapidly. Like I kind of feel like I'm, you know, we're one of the last hunter gatherers, and agriculture is about to be invented or something. Like, you know, there's this epochal shift, and you know, just enjoy the world as it is right now and like savor it. I'm trying to do that a lot. You know, so live in the moment a bit, and you know, spend time with my little children and all that kind of stuff. I think, you know, that's probably good advice anyway, but I think it's actually sort of sharpened by this feeling that you know, the world might be in for radical change. I mean, the other thing, obviously, I think is try and sort of, you know, we're at this, you know, potentially very, you know, impactful moment for the long term, and to the extent that you can sort of nudge the trajectory in a good way versus a bad way, it's really hard to know how to do that. Really hard to know how. But you know, to the extent that you find yourself able to or connected to any of those big decisions, I mean, obviously that would be something to be very proud of if you could.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end it. Thank you so much for talking to me today, Mark.
Likewise, good to talk to you.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye.